Welcome, friends, to the first session of this year's Continuing Quaker Education program. Next July marks the 400th anniversary of George Fox's birth. So we thought, yeah, it's a pretty good occasion to try and center a program around. And so today and next month, we'll be talking specifically about George Fox. But we don't want to view Fox's insight, excitement, commitment as something that, happened 350 years ago. We do believe it's ongoing, and so the rest of our program this year, we will be asking Adelphi friends to talk about how they have heard the Spirit over the course of their life and how they have tried to follow those leadings. So what I'm going to talk about today for a little while, maybe 20, 25 minutes, is I'm going to start with what I think of as the authorized biography of George Fox. And then I'm going to talk a little about some of the things that are not in the authorized biography. And I'm going to close with a little reflection on how I think we got from there 350 years ago to here, 2023, at Adelphi Friends Meeting House. So when I say the authorized biography, there's actually no body that authorizes Quaker biographies. Actually, that's not true. There was for a while, but that's actually not relevant here. But there is a version of the George Fox story that I see everywhere, pretty much on every Quaker website, in every pamphlet on Quakerism, etc. And it goes something like this. In July of 1624, George Fox was born in a small town in the English Midlands that at the time was called Drayton in the Clay and is now called Penny Drayton. George Fox was an unusually serious young man, child and then young man. He was particularly interested in spiritual matters. This was during the Civil War in England between the Royalists, who were Church of England, and Cromwell's army, who were Puritan, time of great religious ferment. The young George Fox traveled. Well, he spoke to the wise people in his village, spoke to the village priest, traveled to neighboring villages, tried to meet with as many traveling ministers and teachers as he could, asking them questions about spirituality, and got no answers that satisfied him. He was the son of a weaver. He was apprenticed as a shoemaker. At about the age of 17, I think it was, he left his apprenticeship and started traveling more widely, particularly in the Midlands and a bit in northern England. Continuing to search for answers to these kind of existential questions that he had. And it wasn't until he found himself on top of a hill one night, utterly despairing, having, as he said, given up all hope in men, when he had what he called an opening. we might call it an epiphany. He felt the presence of God, and he felt the divine in communion with him. And his recognition was that there is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to thy condition. And he knew this through experience. So this fired up George Fox. He continued to traveled increasingly widely, preached, disrupted sermons, stood up in the middle of marketplaces, and kind of spread the word of this this opening, this revelation that he had received. It proved very popular. He developed many adherents. In the course of their preaching, Fox himself and many of the early friends ran afoul of the English authorities. Actually, both the Puritans, and then after the monarchy was restored, the Royalists as well. George Fox himself spent 8 chunks of time in prison, 4 of those under Cromwell and 4 of those under Charles II. These affected his health over the long term. Kind of before the later imprisonments, Fox had traveled beyond England. He'd been in the Netherlands, he'd been in Ireland, and he paid 2 visits to the American colonies, both Barbados and Jamaica, as well as the mainland. But like I say, eventually the imprisonments did take a toll on him, and he spent the last 15 or so years of his life considerably more sedentary than his youth. He is known for formulating kind of the core theology, if you want to call it that, of the Religious Society of Friends, where the key insight is that we experience the divine directly ourselves without the need for any intermediary, neither a specially trained person, nor a text, nor anyone else's interpretation. That there is a seed of the divine, which we often call the inner light, in every person. That divine revelation comes equally to all people, to women, men, children, Christians, Jews, Muslims, etc. And that worship, that reflective, silent worship in community is an effective method for connecting with the divine. Eventually, George Fox married Margaret Fell, who at that point was the widow of a judge. She had been a big supporter of Fox and was the person who turned this kind of charismatic movement into an organization, into the Religious Society of Friends. Certainly some of the teachings that Fox is best remembered for would be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage in life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone. Or another, Christ says this and the apostles say this, but what canst thou say? Art thou a child of light, and hast walked in the light? And what thou speakest, is it inwardly from God? And then kind of the last quote that I want to highlight right now is, I told the Commonwealth Commissioners I lived in the virtue of that life and power that took away the occasion for all war. I told them I was come into the covenant of peace, which was before wars and strife were. So the authorized biography is, a fairly heroic tale. And I believe it is largely factually accurate. I believe it's incomplete. And so I'd like to fill in some of those pieces as well. First of all, I think it's useful to remember that George Fox did not create the Religious Society of Friends by himself. In fact, if events had unfolded just slightly differently, I believe we would be looking to James Naylor as the founder of Quakerism. In fact, for a good chunk of time, James Naylor was much better known, much more popular, much more influential within this growing movement than George Fox was. In addition, the role of Margaret Fell, I think, is acknowledged, but I'm not sure we actually assign it the value. Without Margaret Fell, there would be no Religious Society of Friends. This would have been one of these charismatic movements that bloomed and collapsed, just like many comparable religious kind of upwellings during that time. It's also useful to remember that George Fox was a human being, that he had all the foibles that many human beings have. So a word about, how do we know, what do we know about George Fox actually, and how do we know it? There are contemporary accounts. He was a public figure, and other people wrote about their encounters with him. He sent out, well, he wrote a whole bunch of pamphlets. He sent out a bunch of epistles. Some of his sermons were captured and republished. So we know something about him from his own writing. And then there is his journal. And pretty much everything we know about Fox's early life comes from the first 10 pages of his journal. And it's useful to remember that at that time, journal did not mean a diary. In other words, it was not a contemporary account, more or less contemporaneous account of things as they happened. Journal meant autobiography. So George Fox's journal was, for the most part, dictated by him to an assistant kind of 20 years after many of the events that he portrays. And I think Fox probably suffers from a slightly selective memory and may remember some things in a slightly rosier light than one might think if one were there. In any case, it's pretty clear that George Fox had really poor social skills. I think he was a really hard person to be around. I think he was rude, he was abrasive, He thought extremely highly of himself. He could carry a grudge. He could be vindictive. And, after that section in his journal where he talks about his despair at not being able to find answers, and then, that Christ has come to teach his people himself. After that moment, I don't see any indication that Fox ever questioned himself for the rest of his life, that he ever asked, am I on the right path? Am I understanding this correctly? As far as I can tell, he was just utterly convinced of his righteousness as an interpreter of God's messages, which I imagine made him kind of hard to have dinner with. So next month, Chloe is going to talk about kind of Fox, the charismatic leader, and Fox, the disruptor, which I think is going to be a whole lot of fun because there's a lot to say and there's some really good stories there. But I want to talk about a few things. Fox, the theologian, that really trouble me, that I have a hard time with. So Fox talked about the ocean of darkness and the ocean of light, the ocean of darkness and death, the ocean of light and love, and how the ocean of light and love washes over the ocean of darkness. And I have always interpreted darkness as the absence of light. So darkness is a hole into which light pours and can fill. That's not what George Fox meant at all. For Fox, darkness was an active force in the universe. Evil was a power as strong as good. And, I think when you read the journal, you come across citations to Satan almost as often as you come across citations to God. So Satan as the embodiment of evil, evil as an active universal presence, and the battle between good and evil, the kind of apocalyptic battle between good and evil as kind of the center of spirituality, or at least a core element of it, doesn't sit well with me. Another thing I find troubling about the journal is that Fox describes himself performing miracles right and left. Like every 3-4 pages, he's healed another sick person. Fox describes himself traveling through England, healing the sick and doing other miraculous things. Interestingly, the second edition of the journal was George Fox's journal was published after his death. And the second edition took out all mention of miracles. They cut that. They excised that from the text because they were afraid that it would open them to charges of blasphemy. Because Fox was clearly setting himself up as a saint. He was kind of checking the boxes. What in the Catholic, I actually don't know about Anglican, Church of England, but there's kind of a set of hurdles that you have to pass to be declared a saint. And as far as I can tell, Fox was trying to kind of check those boxes. one of them is performing miracles. And so Fox describes himself performing miracles. And then the last thing that I want to talk about a little bit is, so I mentioned earlier that he traveled to the colonies and spent a good amount of time, cumulatively had to have been at least 6 months, in Barbados. Barbados actually at the time was much more important than any of the colonies on the mainland. There were more British colonists there, and there was considerably more wealth being produced through tobacco and then sugar than any of the colonies on the mainland. But then Fox also, so Fox was Barbados, in Jamaica, in the colonies. A fun fact, he happened to be in Maryland when a visiting English friend called for a meeting of all Quakers in the province of Maryland, which took place over 4 days, a little south of Annapolis. Since George Fox was in the area, he joined. He writes about this wonderful, wonderful gathering, and that was the origin of Baltimore Yearly Meeting. So George Fox actually was at the founding of BYM. But in addition to things like witnessing the founding of Baltimore Yearly Meeting, Fox witnessed chattel slavery. He would, especially in Barbados, stayed with slaveholders, spoke with enslaved people, and and then again in the colonies on the mainland, had the same experience, and he did this on 2 consecutive trips separated by about 5 years. So he actually had plenty of time to think about this. And he kind of responded in some ways. He emphasized in the colonies that Christ had died for all people, white, black, and native. He advocated the humane treatment of enslaved people. For a period, kind of early on, he dropped this, but for a period, he advocated that enslaved people should be freed after 30 years of servitude, which would have made enslaved people more similar to indentured servants. Indentured service was a very common thing at the time as well, typically for like 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. So early on, Fox advocated that enslaved people be freed after 30 years, but he dropped that. He stopped talking about it. And he did insist that marriage between enslaved people was just as valid as marriage between white people. Fox never addressed chattel slavery as an institution. He does not appear to have even considered really whether the gospel that he was preaching was in alignment with the power structures, the social conditions, the brutal and barbaric treatment of the people he met of African descent. I mean, these were mostly first, second generation Africans. In the West Indies in particular, I mean, the mortality rate was sky high. So enslaved people kept being brought to the island to replace all the previous enslaved people who had died. This is not something that Fox could possibly not have seen. He must have witnessed this. And yet, he doesn't seem to have spent a whole lot of time thinking about it. And I find that very disturbing. So, kind of a question in my mind is, so how did we get, and basically what all of this brings home to me is that George Fox was a very different person than I am. And he lived in a very different time than I do. And the things he took for granted and the things he was revolting or rebelling against, in many ways don't mean that much to me. And conversely, the things that I take for granted and the things that I resist may not have meant that much to him. And so the question is, how did we get from there to here? How did we get from a man named George Fox in 1660s England to those of us gathered today in our worship space? And how is it that we feel that we're part of the same tradition? Because speaking personally, there is much that truly stirs me when I read George Fox. And there's also stuff that really bothers me. So how do we get from here to there? From there to here? And I think the answer is continuing revelation. I think that George Fox, one of the things that he really did do is take his conviction to the limit. If we believe that the divine speaks to us, every one of us, in exactly the same manner as Spirit spoke to Fox or Jesus or Moses or any of the other prophets or Muhammad or Abraham or Buddha, if we believe that that conversation is ongoing, then we have to believe that we might understand things a little differently than our forebears did, which is not to discard how wise people, friends before us, heard and interpreted Spirit, but to supplement it. And that as our conditions change and as material conditions change around us, we may be receptive to hearing the divine in new ways. And that new revelation changes who we are as individuals and as a community. The reason that I love learning about history and Quaker history in particular is that I can kind of see this unfolding of new insight, of leadings that earlier friends had not had. And, some of them were very fruitful, some were not. But I do believe there is a continuous line from George Fox to Adelphi monthly meeting, with a lot of upheaval between those 2 points. So I think the centrality of continuing revelation to Quaker thought and practice is one of the things that is just special about us, that I celebrate, and that I think makes all the difference. What I would like to leave you with are a couple of queries. Query number one: the thoughts, convictions, and actions of friends from long ago, in many ways very different from us today, still retain the power to inspire us. Do you believe we hear the Spirit in the same or similar ways as our Quaker forebears? Query two: continuing revelation as a concept seems pretty clear, but only with hindsight. For the people living through turbulent times, their condition often feels foggy, confused, uncertain, and rarely a whole lot of fun. 50 years from now, will friends look back at our times and say, aha, those Quakers really nailed truth in their discernment? And if so, what insights do you think they might be referring to? And then finally, does knowing less or more about the history of the Religious Society of Friends influence your relationship to the Spirit? If we define history as an unfolding narrative of continuing revelation, would that change your answer?